Thank you so much to our two speakers and the four co-researchers, actors. We have a little bit of time for questions, if we can ease a little bit into the coffee break. Sorry. There's one coming right behind.
Hi. This is a question and a comment for you, Patricia. Thank you so much for the presentation and also for bringing my attention to that play, Straight White Men, which I didn't know, but which I definitely need to maybe not watch, but at least read. And I was really glad that you brought also my attention to the relation between debt and the psyche, and having done some work myself on the relation on depression. As this kind of paradigmatic psychopathology of our time, I think it's really important to also highlight the psychological aspects of debt, which also brings us back to some of the things that Annie McClanahan was talking about yesterday. And there's a lot of studies, obviously, quantitative and qualitative, documenting the effects of debt on people and how it increases the risk of various mental illnesses. So that was my comment. I was really glad to listen to that. And now my question goes back to Ibsen. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit, but also maybe bringing in his play Genganger, or Ghosts, as it's called in English, because that seems also to feed into what you were talking about with the themes of inheritance, indebtedness, of course, Oswald, and illness inherited from his father, but also that particular aspect with the orphanage, which goes up in flames, but also the great irony of the play, as far as I remember it, where the money eventually goes to finance the seaman's home, this bar/brothel, as the two pillars of bourgeois society in a way. So I was just wondering, and of course that play is also about maybe how debt weighs as a nightmare on the brain of the living, right, to quote Marx. Yeah. So I was just wondering if you could maybe speak some more about that.
A little bit. I'm just starting to think about this actually, but I do think what's interesting about Ibsen is actually this sort of psychic weight of debt over the course of the entire set of plays, actually. And I think in the larger piece, I'm kind of interested, well, it doesn't work so much with that play, but the sort of, this relationship between aspiration and debt, I think it is really important in Williams, and it's interesting, but I think there's something else there, in part because it shows up what happens when someone is anti-aspirational. Like, I'm interested in what happens when you look at it in a contemporary way, when you look at someone who might be called anti-aspirational, and the way in which those, like in this case Lee, but others, like the way that works out in contemporary drama, this sort of rejecting that heritage. But I'd want to think more about it, but I think in Ibsen, I feel like it's interestingly confused, psychic debt and monetary debt and inheritance, and I kind of want to lean into the almost like the confusion of rhetorics as sort of the point, I guess, of why I would say like the construction of the tragic hero is always related to debt, and to sort of write an alternate way through that. So that's how I would answer you now. I might answer you differently in a year.
Thank you both. Those were really awesome papers. I had a question for each of you, maybe. I'll try to make them very short. But Jennifer, I was just wondering about, particularly sort of thinking about Patty's piece, about whether or not you also think of, you talked about inheritance as well, right? And I was thinking about the relationship between inheritance and that idea of improvement, and the ways that those are also, in addition to their sort of natural historical origins, that they're also economic, right? And the way that particularly sort of Emersonian American imaginary about independence and the independent entrepreneurial spirit of American capitalism as opposed to the sort of feudal, familial capitalism that they were sort of posing themselves against, right? And the way that the only way that you can sort of justify an inheritance is by claiming to have improved on it, right? So I'm just sort of curious to know whether that aspect of the sort of economic portion of that matters as well. I was also thinking about like Lockean ideas of property and improvement, right? And that like the way that the settler justifies his theft of land and his claim to ownership over land that has been stolen is by claiming to have improved it. And then, Patty, I just want to say, I loved that so much. So that's mostly just a comment. But I was just sort of curious if you could say a little bit about the connection in the Lee play, about the issue of race and its relationship to this, because it seems to me like I've thought for a while that when we talk about neoliberalism, like a lot of times what academics mean is the application of economic exigencies and forms of oppression that have always applied to other people and that are just more new to the professional managerial white middle class, right? So I'm just sort of curious to hear you say something about like how the plot about sort of failed aspiration and that sort of moment of generational immobility relates to the play's sort of exploration of race and privilege. I'm just curious to hear more.
And I haven't seen straight white male, but I was curious about whether the son's refusal to have the debt paid off, I see how it's anti-aspirational. Is it a move for independence as well? He doesn't want to be beholden to his father, or he doesn't want his father's help? It's not that.
Not exactly. It's
Okay.
complicated.
Okay.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I was
simultaneously?
just thinking, my first book was so much about 18th century notions of debt, and it began with Ben Franklin. And Franklin, despite the famous aphorism, neither a borrower nor lender be, and Poor Richard always talking about the problem with debt. I mean, Franklin actually celebrates debt as a way for the man without inherited capital to exceed the limitations of his lacking capital, right? So debt for Franklin is very important for aspiration, for social mobility. Absolutely. And then what do you do with Emerson, or even with Thoreau, I'm thinking of in those kind of monetary terms. We know that Emerson's intellectual work was made possible by the inheritance after his wife dies. I've never thought about this. I don't have a sense that he feels a need to justify it on the basis of improvement, unless that improvement is something that he sees as spiritual and intellectual, right? He's not taking the inheritance so far as I don't know. I'd have to think about it. But I think the inheritance is justified on the basis of what he does with it intellectually. I'm thinking of Thoreau, who also, not a figure who celebrates doing things from scratch. He goes to Walden Pond and he tells us point blank that he's going to buy a shanty from a poor Irish immigrant and use all the scrap material to build his house. So the whole notion that this is somehow independent living, which students often assume when they come to Walden, is clearly not at work. And Thoreau is saying, take things, buy things, repurpose things precisely so you can free yourself up mentally and intellectually from the important work. So I think both of them would justify either inheritance or acquired materials that actually allow you to get on with the real work of thinking, which of course is a privileged position that you need to talk about with your students. And when Thoreau buys that shanty from the Irish immigrant is then homeless. And there's no real awareness on Thoreau's part that he's displaced this Irish immigrant in order to save time in his own work so that he can then read and write.
So the let me answer your question first. So it isn't really independent. So the whole plot is that there's all this agita because he's gone home to take care of his father and he's living back at home. And what's interesting is he wants to both not take his father's money and stay living with his father and stay in that relationship. So what happens in the last version of the play is that his father tries to give him the money. He doesn't want to take the money, but then his father's so angry that he doesn't take the money that he kicks him out of the house. So it's actually this kind of interesting thing where he wants to stay tied to the father but not take his money, and he wants to stay tied to his father in this sort of form of labor that's not wage labor. So it's actually it's a desire for interdependence by him, but they can't understand that given their investment in him. So that's the answer to that question. And I think that's also a Doll's House moment, right? It's like the slam, there's no door slam. They try to push him out and he doesn't leave. I guess the second piece of it would be, there are a couple ways race comes into play. There's the dramaturgical way, which is there's always this thing in the background where they keep talking about, they order takeout from an Asian restaurant owned by a Korean American family, and the way Lee brings non-white people into this play is that they bring in this takeout, but then there's like a scene where they talk about the fact that they had to expand their restaurant. So it's sort of this entrepreneurial model minority. That's one way race gets talked about in terms of the anti-aspirational nature of the straight white man. The other piece I think is embedded in that scene that was written, which is the reason his father doesn't respect his labor is because he's doing he says, if I want to, I could have a nurse. There are all these moments. It's clear that the ghost of that is the labor of women of color as caregivers, which he's willing to do the work of, but his father is basically like, we can outsource that. Why are you doing this given what I've invested into you? So that's the ghost, I think, is that form of caregiving labor is talked around in the play. So I think those are the two places where race really comes into play.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for these two wonderful papers. I have a question or a thought, maybe for both of you. I was wondering, so we often consider that on, let's say, on a diegetic level, plays about that, characters talking about that, writers expressing thoughts about that. Now, I had the impression, Jennifer, that you made a move toward considering that not on the diegetic level, but on a sort of meta-diegetic level, that is to say, writing as such, being indebtedness. And I was really struck, and I also wanted to thank our wonderful performers by the excerpt of Death of a Salesman, when the dialogue itself started to look like an accounting. Mm-hmm. Right? Now, it made me think of Godard, so a comparison with film. Godard in a film called Scénario pour le film Passion. So it's a film about his writing a scenario. He says that scenario, how do you say, story? Scenario. Script, yes. That script in film, script as such, evolved from accounting. So he says there in the beginning, it's a sort of mythological tale almost. He says in the beginning there was no script and just someone shooting and a guy running after, I don't know, girl, cop, whatever. And he says slowly accounting was introduced because it cost money, and that's where the script comes from. So I was wondering if such a scene like in Death of a Salesman could be considered as as a bare, accounting scene, and does that have something to do with the very structure of theatrical narratives?
I mean, I guess the short answer is I think so, actually. And I think it's at that very historical moment that the accounting happens. There's the accounting of all of the debts, right? But I think it's actually related to a very particular plot point, right? Which is he wants to give his son this ability to start a business. And the way he decides to do that is he commits suicide so that his insurance, he'll get the life insurance so that the son will be able to use that life insurance money in order to be able to get what they want. So I actually, I don't know if diegetic is the word, but I guess what I miss sometimes in other analyses is just at the level of plot, the mechanism of plot, like the way that these things have to work at the mechanism of plot in a very formal way that's political but is not about content. So yes, I think so. I mean, I'm thinking about the way that scene looks laid out on the page, and it does look, the lines get very staccato, so I think you're right that it starts to almost look like a ledger, almost. Yeah.
Jennifer, did you want to?
Yeah, I can't think of a way to answer that question. I was going back to my first book and thinking chapter by chapter. Is there something? I mean, I remember thinking a lot in that book, which feels ages ago, about accounting and readers more than writers. That there were many early American writers I looked at who were thinking about the way a merchant mindset made for a particular type of reading experience, particularly curiosity about how a plot would unfold, which these writers would link to a kind of forward-looking, speculative mindset.
If I could just jump on with
Yeah.
this as well, because I think even the language of Death of a Salesman, right? It wasn't until you began to talk about it in terms of death that I started to think about the formulations, right? And the formulation attention must be paid, right? It's not interest being paid, it's attention. I wonder if we could think about that as a model for the role of the leaching out of the space of the playwright into other areas and other publics and maybe other times.
Yeah, I mean, think that very particular discourse about how that is right is totally there, actually.
Because he's described as losing his balance, right? That's
losing his balance, and he sort of drives off the road, right? I mean, there's this whole way in which equilibrium is undone, right? So, and I think what I find is so striking is that these Marxist critics who've done very good work, like somehow aren't not quite landing on that language. And I do, Linda gets pushed to the side, but I'm just sort of like, women are the caretakers of debt in these plays. Like, they're the ones who suffer the consequences of unpaid debt in a different way than the male characters. And I think there's something that has to be undone there. I mean, Young Jean Lee's play doesn't have any female characters. The mother's dead, right? Like, that's important, actually, that there's not a female in that play.
Is it important in the case of Emerson? You were talking about the great man narrative.
Yeah, I mean, a few things come to mind. One is there's a very important early American kind of women's advocate, we would call her a feminist, Judith Sargent Murray, who believes so strongly that women actually bear the brunt of their husband's misfortunes in a very volatile market. And she herself had a husband who was a merchant who went bankrupt through no fault of his own, and recalled hiding behind the closed blinds of her house as the creditors came calling. And much of her feminism was based on advocating education for women in accounting, so that they could kind of navigate the vicissitudes of the economy, particularly if they didn't marry as well. So if they were married, they had to deal with their husband's misfortunes, and if they did not marry themselves, they had to learn how to invest and make money. But as far as Emerson and masculinity, all I would say is, obviously there's such a long association of indebtedness and emasculation, right? That Pocock calls the economic man of the 18th century a feminized man, that masculinity is self-sufficiency and to be dependent on a whimsical market, to be dependent on your creditors is to be feminized. In my own first book, and this relates a little to theater, I do study a playwright, Royal Tyler, who actually, I think, plays with that a bit, and turning the repaying of a debt into a performance in the kind of manly sense of performing, not performance in the sense of play acting or a charade, but performing, doing one's duties, performing as a man. And performing a debt was the language that they used in the early national U.S. So it was a way actually for a man to show his manliness, to undertake a debt and pay it off, which is a very different way of thinking about debt. It's very Hamiltonian.
That's great. Thank you so much to both of our speakers.